I'm very much pleased to introduce our speaker, Pamela Lahey, who has been an active member of CRWDP for quite a long time. And until very recently, she was also a research associate with the Institute for Work and Health. So just a bit of an introduction. Pam has received her PhD in rehabilitation science from McMaster University earlier this year. Pam has recently accepted a position with Employment and Social Development Canada as a research advisor, right? To work in the area of policy development for accessibility, what's related to accessibility issues. And Pam, your colleagues at CRWDP and myself, we're very much happy that your new position will allow you to further continue growing in this area as a researcher. And we wish you all the best in your new role. And we're sure that you are the right person who can help policy changes to move in the right direction. And we will miss you a lot here when you leave. Your incredible skills, your dedication, your optimism, and your energy, it has been a great asset to CRWDP. And people who joined us, you may know that Pam was leading the development of the student community with CRWDP. So now we have a kind of an established community thanks to Pam. And she is also actively involved in Disability and Work in Canada initiative, supporting the consultations, analysis of the feedback that we have received, and supporting various activities and events related to this initiative. Okay, Pam, back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you. So my presentation today is emerges from my doctoral research, and one of the studies that came from that research is a qualitative study that was conducted with people, former recipients of the Ontario Disability Program, and service providers that provided employment supports to people who were looking at transitioning out of or working in wanting to get employment, in the competitive labor market, and also ministry staff. So the presentation is entitled Leaving Welfare for Work, Parallels to a Hostage Negotiation, and it is currently in review with the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. You may wonder why this study was important to do. And there are a number of reasons. One is that the unemployment rate for people with mental illness has remained stubbornly high. Really sorry about that. Lesson number one, always turn off your phone when you're doing a presentation. So why this study? Because the employment rate for people with mental illness is really stubbornly high, despite the numerous system improvements over the past 2 decades. And the system and individual level factors that prevent people from mental illness from securing and retaining employment have been well documented in Canada and abroad. However, the literature narrows significantly when exploring the barriers to employment encountered by people with mental illness who are in receipt of income benefits. And even less is known about the specific system and individual level factors that facilitate exit from disability income support programs for employment. The purpose of this study then is to explore or examine the individual and system level factors that facilitate or hinder exits from Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP, which I will refer to it from now on, for recipients with mental illness. And when I talk about exits, I'm talking about work exits. So people who have made enough income that they do not qualify for income support. they can still receive, and many do still receive the medical benefits, but don't receive income benefits. And this is what I refer to as a work exit. So I'm really just going to briefly take you through the methodology because I want to focus on the findings. I used a constructivist grounded theory approach. I collected 13 semi-structured interviews with the 3 participant groups I mentioned in the summer of 2017. And I used a number of inclusion and exclusion criteria, one of which I will draw your attention to. I excluded anyone who has not had a work exit for longer than 6 months. And if I don't address this again in the presentation, feel free to ask me about that in the Q&A. The data analysis consisted of an interpretive or iterative, I can't believe I stumbled over that word, but iterative approach to coding and thematic formation. And I managed the data in an online mixed method platform called Deduce. So I'm going to quickly also take you through the demographics. I interviewed 6 recipients, 3 male, 3 female, and 4 of those 6 were former recipients. 2 have since cycled back, meaning they had met the inclusion criteria, had been off of work for more than 6 months, but have since gone back onto ODSP. The range of employment for these recipients is really varied, from addiction counselor, construction, to cook supervisor, industrial cleaner, correctional officer, and somebody that works in the service industry. So as you can see, a variety of occupations. The time on assistance range from anywhere from 2 years to 15 years, and the time off of assistance range from anywhere from 1.5 years, so 1.5 years to 6.5 years. Okay, so the findings. There was a primary finding that emerged from the data, and this is a metaphor, and the metaphor then framed the themes that came out of the study. So the metaphor for the employment process that emerged from the data came from a number of participants, the feeling that people are trapped on the system. But it was the words of one regional director, so a ministry staff, that actually created the language that was used in this study. And this regional director said that employment is the difference between sort of being a hostage to a system, since there are no other systems that people can shop around for. I mean, really, we have hostages, not clients. That was really powerful. And in fact, that finding of a hostage is not new. It has been raised in other studies. Primarily, I've not seen it in a Canadian study, but I have seen them in American studies where this idea of people being hostages to the system and using that very violent sort of language, that image that comes up as being very apt to what recipients experience trying to get out of ODS, trying to get off of the system. So I'm going to take you through the hostage negotiation process now, which is the metaphor that I've created a graphic for. And for those people who aren't able to see it, I will talk us through the process. So the process starts with people picking themselves back up. And what that means is they go through a process where they pick themselves back up or get re-engaged with life after a medical or life crisis that brought them onto ODSP. So they have to go through that acclimatization process first before they can move on. And then some of them go on to, and all of the ones actually that I interviewed, discuss this idea of needing to break the rules that are set by ODSP in order to get ahead and certainly in order to exit for work. And then they all go, whether they exit or they don't exit, or they exit for a short period of time and come back on, they all go through a process where they have to stabilize their illness in order to be successful in employment. And then they, and the final stage before they either exit or stay on assistance is they get supports in order to exit. And that area of supports is very rich. It was very rich in data. Supports mean a number of different things. I'm going to take you through that in a moment. But what's important to know about that is the people who get the supports that enable them to exit ODSP for work are able to strategize. They're able to tap into their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their persistence. They're therefore able to secure a good job with steady pay or good pay and a sense of stability. What this means is that they secure decent jobs, not precarious employment. And for those people, they do exit, and they do tend to stay permanently off of ODSP. And I reiterate, off of ODSP income supports, although they may access medical benefits. And for those people that exit, ODSP is seen as a stopgap measure. But for those people who don't exit, ODSP is seen as a safety net. And the reason for that is because after they go through that process that I've already described, the supports they received haven't been as robust or as essential as the supports that the other people have, the other recipients accessed. And because of that, because the supports are less stable, they're more tenuous, they tend to end up in jobs that are precarious. They have trouble with job retention, or they go through multiple jobs. And that process itself leads them to cycling in between employment and ODSP. Therefore, they may leave ODSP for a certain amount of time, but they tend to cycle back onto ODSP. For those people, they see ODSP as a safety net. So that's the process, the hostage negotiation process sort of explained. And if there are any questions afterwards, I'd be happy to provide further clarification. So the four themes that emerge from the analysis are constructs of the larger hostage negotiation metaphor. And those are the four themes that I've talked us through already: picking yourself back up, breaking the rules to get ahead, stabilizing illness for employment support or employment success, my apologies, and getting supports that are vital to successful system exit. So picking yourself back up, as I mentioned, refers to a person's ability to rally after a health or life event that precipitated their arrival on ODSP. As I mentioned, these people can personal characteristics of resilience and persistence in order to stay the path, as this one addiction counselor's quote indicates. I know it's going to take me longer to get off ODSP because of lack of working, but I'm doing it, and that's the end of it. And then you have a quote from a cook supervisor who talked about the long-term goals he had set for getting off assistance. So this is another characteristic of people who are successful at exiting and staying gone, is those who are able to strategically and systematically think through a long-term process and achieve incremental goals until they get to their final goal, as this quote illustrates. I went out and I found things that I wanted to do, and I did them. I started volunteering and realized how much I enjoyed it. So then I got hired on as a cook and eventually got into the program as a cook supervisor. I want to do it better, and I was not thinking employment at this point. So I went and I got a student loan out and I went that way, and then went back and continued in a supervisory position before I got hired on to where I am now. So you can see this wasn't something that he did overnight. It was, again, working toward that longer term goal. And this was, I thought, a very interesting, not surprising, but interesting that those people who chose to move ahead and strive toward full-time employment that would get them off of ODSP are those people that were willing to break the rules. And an industrial cleaner, an example, a quote from this industrial cleaner talks about what that meant for her. So the amount of money that you're allotted does not even come close to helping a person just pay for the basic necessities of life. So in order for me to break away ever from this system, I need to make the money to pay the bills and to buy stuff. And for her, this meant that she bartered services in exchange for other services or resources that she needed, such as money for gas to get to work. And she said, without doing that and not claiming the bartering, she never would have gotten ahead. Because had she had to claim the bartering, as the official rules say that you have to, that bartering is an economic activity, so you have to impugn an amount to it, she did not do that because they would have clawed that money back and she'd be no further ahead. Stabilizing illness was something everyone had to do, regardless if they exited for a short period of time or they exited or their intention was to exit for good from ODSP. It really, stabilizing illness was a precondition to work exits. As this one job developer has stated, and this was echoed by all other participants, if a person obviously is doing well and taking their medications, and it's making them able to focus, and it's making them able to, get there on time and complete the tasks and be a productive employee, definitely the medications are an important factor. If they start to go off the medications and then everything falls apart, I mean, that can be detrimental. And as one participant, FUMA, that's a pseudonym, so all participants, I provided pseudonyms for them. I considered people who even made an attempt at employment given the conditions of the income security program. I found them that in my eyes, they were all survivors and they were all warriors. And so I gave them warrior names. So Fuma was one of the participants. And he said that he described the impact of removing resources from employment. So here he says, a mentally ill person not taking their medication is usually a really very negative thing. So the first thing that happens when you break an ODSP rule, if you didn't stock up on your meds, you're out of them in 3 days. Now go ahead and make good decisions. So that really, I think hits home the point that if you don't have the resources you need to exit, you're not going to stay off of the system. It also actually refers to breaking the rules as well, because he mentions that he broke the rules and therefore he was penalized, and without having that access to that medication, he couldn't stay employed. So getting supports is vital to system exit, and support means different. It broke down actually into 3 sub-themes. So let me take you through the first illustration of what it means to the role that supports play in system exit. And this is from the ministry staff. It's the flexibility and the security and the removal of fear that if I fail, what will happen to me? And that's, I think for me, that's one of the fundamental things that happen at that transition time, that the clients or the person understands that if something happens, that the flexibility goes back to, you can come back on. What the ministry staff here is referring to is the rule within ODSP of rapid reemployment. So in theory, you can exit ODSP, and if it doesn't work out, you can get fast track back onto ODSP so that you don't lose, you don't go without income support. Now, another addiction, the addiction counselor, also that I referred to later, or earlier, sorry, also talked about supports in the sense of networking. So those professional supports that you need to set up for yourself to get a job. And he says, I met the director of X, who's a social worker. We just kept in touch. We just connected very well. We had coffee a couple of times, and one of those nurses told me, oh, there's a position open. And that was just at the time when I felt ready. Now, an employment provider talked about a different type of support that was beneficial or that was vital to system exit. And that was, again, going back to this personal characteristic of having the mindset that they had a certain expectation for themselves and the type of job that they wanted. So it wasn't just about their education, although certainly education was helpful. It didn't come up as a major theme in the study. What did come up was that feeling that and perhaps because they were educated, they felt that they weren't going to accept a mixed job. They wanted something more substantial and something within their skill set. So this employment provider says it's not about that they're actually finding jobs in their education background or fields, but that they just come in maybe with a different expectation of what they're capable of and what they're going to go for. Now, Cedric, also a pseudonym, and a former recipient, believed that the purpose of ODSP employment supports is to help those recipients who want to supplement their income in ODSP. So to Cedric and to a number of other participants, they felt that ODSP wasn't about, it wasn't geared to get people off of employment, that the focus of employment or the priority of employment into on ODSP or for those people on ODSP was, as in Cedric's words, was to dabble in part-time stuff. Ministry staff explained that employment is just one component of a larger social inclusion strategy. So sort of support for Cedric's feeling that, you know, that case managers caseworkers only help you dabble in part-time stuff. The ministry sort of provides credibility for that by saying, at some point, your caseworker is required to call you and conduct what we call active case management, which is to call you and not frighten you and not scare you, but to call you and say, you've been on ODSP for a while. How can we connect into the community? And further conversation led into, you know, this is really just part of a larger social inclusion goal. So the policy implications, and I could go on and on with rich quotes, but I don't have the time. So let's move into policy and research implications. Two broad issues were at play in this study. One is that there was a fundamental tension between social services and health services, and that the other implication was that there was this blame game going on. And let me walk you through both of those policy implications. So the first one is that ODSP employment supports is to get people into employment. As I said, not necessarily full-time employment to get off of ODSP, but just to supplement their earnings maybe. But that is an isolated activity. It's not connected to the other supports, the wraparound supports that people with mental illness need to sustain employment. As this one participant, Raphael, also pseudonym, indicated. So having no access to timely mental health support proved to be a continued employment challenge. And Raphael says, right, gives us an understanding of what would have happened if he had that timely mental health support and how he could have transitioned into employment much sooner. You know, if they give me somatic treatment when I needed it, really, I mean, let's say 2008 when I got there, by 2010, easily, I was going to be able to fully work and be independent. It would save, I don't know, 4 years of ODSP payments. You know what I mean? They keep you there. They keep you there, and many of those, probably half of those, they don't need to be there. That's it, and that's sad. So it refers to him receiving treatment that he wasn't able to get on ODSP. Not only do they not provide access to mental health supports, that's something that you have to find on your own outside of employment supports program, but also somatic treatment is not something covered under OHIP, the Ontario Health Insurance Program. So he had to beg and borrow and borrow money from friends to get treatment outside the country. It was that treatment outside the country that led him on his path to recovery. And so that just shows you, you know, the importance and the value of providing investments in mental health. Another, so that was the one tension I talked about between social and health services. The other tension is the blame game. And that blame game is, when we talk about that, we're talking about the neoliberal policies and approaches and the structure of the income benefit program. And that structure is, you know, to blame the participant for having a mental illness. Like, they have a mental illness, so it's their fault that they can't get employment. And if they can't get employment, like, it's some sort of personal defect within them. Like, it's nothing to do with the system itself and the way it's structured. It's a personal defect. So that's the blame game that I talk about. That blame game leads to producing work, for sure, but not necessarily quality long-term employment. And underlying that policy assumption is that recipients who exit, who are successful, who exit are going to be successful. But that's not necessarily the case, as I've already indicated. There are a number of things, resources that have to be put in place to make that possible. So the findings suggest, therefore, that ODSP is not designed to facilitate exit out of employment, and that systematic change is needed in order for that to happen, such as co-location of employment supports with mental health supports. But there's a question mark, a big question mark, and that is, in the absence of political will that system change happen? So the future research directions that emerge from this study is the need to look beyond immediate short-term solutions. So look beyond the dabbling in part-time employment to look for employment success indicators, such as the quality of job that somebody's getting. It's looking at organizational culture. So what is that workplace ethos, and how does that create a barrier to retention of employment? And also, in order to do more research in this area, we need richer data sets. We need to take the data set that we have, such as ODSP administrative data, and link it to tax files so that we can look longitudinally at somebody's economic trajectory. I want to, and actually I zipped right through this really quickly, non-intentionally. So I'm probably 5 minutes short, but that's okay. It just leaves more time for questions that I can answer for you. But first, before we move to the Q&A, I wanted to thank my funders that made this study possible, and that is the Joseph Armand Bombardier Graduate Scholarship, the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, which is a Social Science and Humanities Research Council partnership grant, and also the Rehab Science McMaster University funding. So those are my 3 funders, and I want to thank them profusely for allowing this research to exist. There is a list of references here that I used, not a complete list of references, but just the references that I used within this PowerPoint. And so this will be up on the YouTube channel at some point, and you will have access to all of these slides. And then I am ready to take your questions or any comments that you have. And my email address is listed on the slide. So thank you so much for listening. And we are actually going to go to the Q&A section right now.
So that's a big question. So hopefully I can articulate it clearly in a few minutes. To get on ODSP is quite the process. You have to have a diagnosed illness, whether that's physical illness or other types of illness like mental illness, mental health condition. And mental health condition is actually the leading diagnosis for people going on to ODSP today. There are 2 ways of doing it. Most people will go on to OW first, the Ontario Works, which is a general welfare program, in order to just have some money because they're not working and because they're not well. Because you go on, you turn to ODSP when you're in crisis and you're not doing well. And we know that ODSP, the research tells us that it takes, it can take anywhere between 3 months to 2 years to get on ODSP. And in fact, it gets, that time, that wait period has shortened, and the wait period is also dependent on the illness that you have. Because if you have an illness that's really obvious that to the adjudicators, then they approve you almost immediately, which immediately means 3 to 6 months. For somebody who, for example, has a mental illness and the mental illness is invisible, it's harder to prove the disability affects your ability to work and make a living and function. And so that can be harder for you to get on. So most people go on OW first and then go on ODSP. Some people, though, if they go into a hospital, if they're hospitalized for the health condition, can get, it's a quicker way to get onto ODSP. They don't have to go through OW first. They can immediately get onto ODSP through their healthcare provider. Now, having said that, once they're on ODSP, most people are just worried about getting the income first because now they've been without income for a number of months and they're really in crisis, right? If their mental illness wasn't bad before, it's really bad once they finally get on ODSP. So employment is not top of mind. But for those people who do want to seek employment and get off, and the people who I'm referring to are the ones that are stopgap. So stopgap recipients. One recipient, former recipient, who's the correctional guard, said that she wanted to use it to stop, take stock, and get back on. So it was a breather for her. So having said that, you can go to a caseworker who does both employment and income. There was a time 2 years ago, in 2010 actually, when there were separate income support workers and employment support workers within the program. Now they've combined those 2 roles. So somebody is an income support worker and an employment support worker. So when they're ready to address employment, they will reach out to their employment worker and say, I would like to start employment. That person, you will usually just, it depends on how busy the office is, because there are regional offices all over Ontario, will usually hand them a long list of employment providers and say, here's a list, go out and find an employment provider, let us know. Well, for a lot of people, that's enough, that's enough of a barrier that it saps their energy and they don't go through that list and therefore they don't pursue employment. For those people who are persistent and resilient and and in a state of mental health that they can go through that list and find the employment providers that they want to work with. They'll go to that employment provider. That employment provider will do an action plan with them. They will set up the earnings exemption process with the ODSP office, so that ODSP office is alerted that they're now looking for employment. And that provider will help them get employment. For the former recipients that exit ODSP for work, and let me make it clear that it's a very, very small number. For the people who seek employment, even on a part-time basis, that's 14% of all ODSP recipients. For the people who actually exit for work, that's 0.13%. For somebody who has a mental illness, is a little higher for somebody with a physical disability, but for somebody with a mental illness, 0.13% actually exit employment for work. Now, once they're off of ODSP, and a lot of people don't go off ODSP because they're afraid of, okay, I'm feeling well now, but what happens if I have another episode and I can't work? Then what am I going to do for income? Well, they have this rule within ODSP that it's rapid reinstatement. As one of the ministry staff said, they have that assurance that they can get right back on if there's a mental health crisis. In theory, that's true. In practice, it doesn't always work that way. And so that's even more of a reason why people are afraid to leave the security of ODSP for employment.
Steve writes, "Hi Pam, did you focus on people on ODSP with mental health challenges?"
Yes, specifically people on ODSP with mental health challenges as their primary diagnosis. So there could be people with physical disabilities that also had mental health conditions as a secondary diagnosis, but I focused on those with a primary diagnosis of mental illness.
Thank you, Pam. Mary Beth McLean asks, can you go back to your method slide? I missed how many providers you interviewed. Let's go back to your,
okay. I believe I said I interviewed 6. I should know it off the top of my head, but you know, once something is done. Yeah, 13 semi-structured interviews, and that's the next slide, isn't it? So it is, oh, actually, I don't think I mentioned that. Or did I? Let me go to this slide. Yes, 4 service providers. I actually had 6 service providers, 4 interviews, so that's a bit misleading.
And Samuch is asking, what a great presentation, thank you, writes Dan. Do you have examples of support programs similar to ODSP that do a better job of ensuring recipients are not treated as hostages? Yeah, it's a great question. Are there any best practices, good examples?
That is a great question. And there are some provinces that do it differently, but they all have an underlying philosophy of neoliberal philosophy of, you know, work, getting a rapid employment. So getting into the employment market as soon as possible and upskilling on the job. Having said that, there are provinces that structure their program differently that do make a difference. For example, in Nova Scotia, they don't have a separate ODSP disability program. They have people with disabilities and people on general welfare in the same program. What they do differently is communication. And maybe it's because it's a smaller province, but the employment providers, they actually have job developers. So let me back up. They do refer out to employment providers, but they also have employment providers within the ministry. So they have job developers within the ministry, so they're more accessible. You can go from income supports right to next door to the employment supports provider, so that process of facilitation is made easier. And if you need more intensive supports, then they will refer you out. What's different about on Nova Scotia is that the communication is outstanding. Somebody doesn't have to go to an income support worker and say, okay, I know I haven't heard from you in like 2 years, but I'd really like to start employment now. Employment support workers will say, would you like to start employment? They'll do that within the intake process. And if not, I will call, we'll call you back and we'll talk about, your employment goals. And so they keep in regular contact with the caseworkers. But not only that, if things don't work out on the job, they say, don't wait until you quit or get fired. Call me if there's an issue, and we will troubleshoot this together. That's something that doesn't happen in Ontario, possibly because of large caseloads. However, Nova Scotia claims that they have large caseloads as well, but it may very well be a different climate for communication that exists in Nova Scotia that doesn't exist in Ontario. That's why this study is so important, is because it not only confirms what we know anecdotally, but it also provides statistics that we don't have. And now we have something to point to. BC does have some of those statistics. And so that's another province I would point to as a place where they're doing some things right. For example, they do annual earnings exemption, which now is going to be happening in Ontario, except that the annual earnings exemption is double what it's going to be in Ontario. But they also don't bridge well between, okay, you've maxed out your income supports because you've worked too much, but here's the bridge to employment, to long-term employment. That doesn't exist in BC either. So what's happening in BC is that, yes, it's a more generous program in terms of the earnings exemption and the annual reconciliation, so the money they're allowed to earn. But what happens is that what they're finding is that most people will now earn up to the $9,000 a year that they're allowed to earn, just under that $9,000, and then they will quit work because, or they will scale back work if they're getting close to that cutoff, because there is no bridge. If I were the one designing the programs, I would lay out all 12 programs on the table, and I would pick the best practices from each of them, and I'd combine them into the one program, because each of them have strengths that, if combined, could really improve the employment outcomes for people with disabilities.
We'll go back to more questions. Mary Beth McLean asks, what are your thoughts on the usefulness of supported employment, or IPS, for this population?
Okay. So I'm really going to do my best here to pull myself as a person out and not enter into a biased perspective here. IPS has been found, the evidence finds that IPS is beneficial for a small portion of people. And those are the people that are not looking to exit the program for work. It's good to get them work experience, get rapid re-entry into the program, and get them skilled on the job. IPS works wonderfully for that. It's proven to be very beneficial. It's not beneficial, however, if you're looking to get employment in an occupation that requires advanced skills, and you need an occupation in an advanced skill setting in order to stay gone from ODSP, because those are the jobs where you're going to make good income, a decent income, and enough income to allow exit off of ODSP. It works really well to get somebody into employment, to get them some experience. Does not work well with job retention and for hire. And actually, there's no evidence around job retention beyond the 5 months, which is, by the way, why I made the exclusion criteria 6 months, because we only have evidence on what happens to people up to 5 months of employment and nothing beyond that.
We have at least 3 more questions online. Mary Beth McLean asks, what are the case managers to client or hostage ratios? Do they have enough time to spend with their clients?
The issues is that they probably have max 20 minutes to spend with each client because they have a 200 to 300 person caseload depending on the region. And so, you know, you can't get to know somebody within 20 minutes. And it takes the development of trust for that trust relationship to lead into a position where they're comfortable enough to work with their caseworker that will translate into success in employment on the job. But also, that 20 minutes is for somebody who wants to pursue employment. They don't, I've showed you, I've given you the numbers, so you get a sense of how little people actually come seeking employment. And because they don't come very often, and because income support workers have been combined with employment support workers, they don't have, the caseworkers don't have the expertise to provide them with employment. And in fact, the employment database is different from the financial income database. So they actually have to access a different database with a different and learn different functions in order to help them get the supports they need. So caseworkers really cringe when they have to provide employment supports, because unless they were an employment support worker first and then transition to income support worker, they don't have the expertise to help people. So they spend so much time trying to prove that they're too sick to work, and now we're saying, but you can work. So that's like that's like a just a silly messaging, right? So for somebody who has been an income support worker, they've gone to their income support worker, they've shared how sick they are, they finally got approved for income supports, they finally have this big relief that now they're getting a paycheck, however inadequate, that they're afraid to go to their income support worker for employment, because while their income support worker is providing their check, their employment support worker is supposed to be friendly and collegial and help foster employment. But one of the case managers said, how can I wear a police hat one day and make sure they're not breaking any of the rules, and then wear my employment hat the next day? The recipient doesn't trust me then. So that's one of the biggest reasons for having two separate roles, I think.
And Steve is saying, Sally Kingsman in BC did a study of women on disability benefits and found that the lack of trust between the recipient and the system was a major barrier to employment, being a way of benefits. Did you find anything similar? Exactly what we...
Exactly what I said. I would reiterate that when you combine roles and have income and employment workers doing the same, like the same person doing the role of income maintenance and policing benefits, and then encouraging people for employment, that leads to an atmosphere of distrust. That's really a multiple question. So,
and we have only 1 minute left.
Right. So let me say, and I may not I may not touch on all of this within the time we have, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. You have my email. I have to say that employment is seen as a priority in ODSP. However, the way it's structured, it would seem that ODSP, that full-time employment and getting off the system is not a priority. It's not a priority for the caseworkers. I would argue that it's a priority for the politicians. So that's a tension certainly within in the program itself. I think there are a number of resources that I mentioned within the presentation that can be used to strengthen
employment support so that more people are successful in leaving, or that more people are more comfortable with pursuing employment. However, under the current environment where they're talking about changing the definition of disability so that people with episodic disabilities will not even go on to ODSP, they will be funneled onto the much lower rate that is offered on Ontario Works. I would argue that less people will take the chance to be employed, because even for those people on ODSP who will be grandfathered under the new definition, nobody knows for sure what that looks like if they decide, hey, I want to try employment and I think I'm well enough to go off. I think I'm well enough to take full-time employment. I think that less people will take the chance on employment because of the policies, the policy reforms that have been proposed and that will be implemented over time. I think that we have set some regressive policies in place and we have not progressed. And I think that I would love to leave this on a positive note, but I can't, because I really don't think that employment for full-time employment in decent jobs will be feasible for people on ODSP.
I really apologize, because I see there are several comments that people could not hear well. I apologize for that. Yeah, probably my voice, probably I'm not loud enough, but what's most important that I'm hoping that you heard Pam's presentation and Pam's response to questions. Thank you, Pam, for the great presentation and for the very rich discussion. As Pam mentioned, don't hesitate to reach to her by the email that she provided, or you can send your question to info@crwdp.ca if you don't have Pam's email address. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We are finishing our webinar. Thank you.